Hi, Lynn. How are you?
Oh, fine. How are you?
Great, great. I have Lynn Ryall here on our Artfest online chat, and Lynn's an artist, a landscape artist, and welcome to our show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've really been loving your paintings and your art. You beautiful landscapes, color, and I have you paint mostly Canadian landscape. I want to find what is it that inspires you about the Canadian landscape and that you love so much.
Well, I grew up going up north in Ontario, probably like a lot of people, from Toronto, and I fell in love with landscape from a very early age. Went to summer camp and canoed and did all sorts of uh, outdoor things like that. And I've had this love from a very, very early age. I'd say even like 8 or 9 years old, of being out in the woods and being near lakes, especially near water, rocks, and the Canadian Shield just blows me off the map, and I'm forever in awe as when I'm walking on paths or trails. So I've always been a huge fan of the Group of Seven. I think my mother took me to an Emily Carr show when I was like 8 years old at the Royal Ontario Museum, and I wanted to be her. So I, so I think that part of it. I don't think I'm untypical in a lot of ways, but it's been a huge passion.
You have no pet monkeys for you, right?
Right, yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yeah, so it's great. So I mean, when you're painting something to really know it, you really have to live it. You have to be in it. So I've
That's right.
and know what you can imagine. Painting from photographs isn't really the same thing. So I tell me how you gather your material for your landscape paintings.
I do it in a variety of ways. I every year I do several trips all over the place, and mostly Ontario parks. But so I'm a huge fan of Ontario parks. In fact, I'm good friends now with the organizer of Ontario, the marketer, Lory Walbrook. But it's one of the things that I do is I go on site. I usually sketch or watercolor paint a lot of times on site first. I do a lot of photographing. I probably have 3 or 4 thousand photographs of landscapes wherever I go, because oftentimes I'm with other people, so you have to keep moving if you're on trails, so you can't sort of stop and paint for forever. But now I'm doing more dedicated painting trips, just with people who are painters, since I've got more of a network now. So it's a combo of photographing plein air, watercolor on site, oftentimes acrylic on site, and then I come back to the studio, and oftentimes what I'll do is I'll turn those sketches, photographs, and drawings into a larger paintings.
Yeah. So plein air. Maybe for our viewers who don't know what that means, you might explain what that means.
Plein air is actually painting on site. You're actually in the you've got your easel, you've got all your equipment, and you're actually painting the scene right on site. And I do that in acrylic. In fact, I've taught that now for the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton and Burlington, and so I've actually taught classes now in it, and it's been a wonderful experience to do that. Like, you're just the results are never necessarily as great as when you're doing work in studio, but it's a great way to get the atmosphere and to feel where you are. And so, and I think that's a really important factor in a painting, is the emotion that you feel at the time that goes into it. So
Yeah, and those. I mean, that's how the Group of Seven worked as well, right?
yes,
And you when you go to the museums, you can see the collection of their sketches.
yes,
They're on little panels. You use that, which you use as well. You use little.
absolutely, absolutely. I do that all the time, and I'm constantly going on site just to create different types of smaller sketches of them. And like, here's an example. Got one here of just a kind of a quickie on site, and it's actually not even it's not even realistic, but it gives me a feeling for the moment and things like that. And so I oftentimes will do that. And I have a lovely backyard too, so I'm very fortunate to, I paint out there a lot as well. And I think it's really important just for your skill level to paint on site, because to paint quickly, I think you capture the essence of something really almost in a way more exact than you would if you're sort of meditating over it for hours or things like that. I think capturing something, a feeling in the moment, is really, really important.
Yeah, and that's what you then can transform into your paintings and
That's right. Yeah.
so what do you do with those sketches? Do you keep them or do you?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, I keep them. I've got a whole. I mean, sometimes I want to burn them, but like, but I keep them, and sometimes I sell them. They're sometimes I will sell them, and in fact, I just did two paintings that I just sold. One was a plein air, and one was a more developed sketch of. We have a creek that runs through our backyard in Hamilton. We're right on the escarpment, and I just sold it to my next door neighbor, which I was really surprised about. But I was surprised he wanted both. But it was sort of because it was partially his backyard that it ran through. But anyway, so yes, that's been. And in fact, one time I was doing plein air, and I sold, and people were walking along. It was up in Ragged Falls Provincial Park in right near Algonquin, near Dwight, and up in Ontario. And a couple came along and said, "Can we offer you money for that?" And I was surprised. I was shocked. Anyway, so it was kind of neat. But anyway, so it was fun.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I don't believe that I'm not so attached to my work that you're always producing more. So I'm ready to, if people want them, I'll certainly sell them, and I've certainly given a lot of pieces too. So
great story and also a memory. Imagine you're out, you go on a trip to Algonquin Park and all of a sudden you can take home a piece of your trip. So it's a nice thing
that's
too.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's a huge part of my soul. Like it really is. So
So I'm just curious, you work in primarily oil paints, but you
mhm.
also do acrylic. Now, how would you approach a, a painting, your painting differently if you were going to work, let's say if you're going to start an oil painting or if you're going to start an acrylic painting, would you approach the piece differently?
Yes, oil painting, because it dries much more slowly. I have to do it in stages much more. Acrylic, because it dries so quickly, you still all paintings require layers of application. So you always have an underpainting layer, and then sort of mid areas, and then finally detail on the top. But oil painting, because it dries so slowly, I find that what I do now is I actually do two or three paintings at a time, and I do all the stages at different sort of timings, and I find that's a really great method, because what happens is that you always get tired when you're doing one painting, and I can overwork things. And so what I found by having the three paintings, it's kind of like aerobic exercise. If you get tired at one stage and then you switch the aerobic exercise, or switch the painting, you get more energy again. And the problem is, if you get tired on a painting, you will do damage to it. And so I have to switch modes in order not to go too far or overwork it, or whatever. So working in threes, so I can actually switch a painting up when I know I'm getting to the end of my ability to work on it for that time period. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. Now, can you just explain too for our viewers, like what is an underpainting? Like what is that? How do you,
Well, an underpainting is, well, I'll give you an example. Like this is kind of this is mid-range underpainting. I don't have a full underpainting, but you can see underneath here that I've got an under orange layer that I started off with a ground, and in this case it was kind of an orange, and then I put flat layers on, sort of basically blocks of color, and I try to put blocks of color on in different sections, And then what happens is I wait for that to dry, and then I go in and I add in, well, here I've started adding in more detail, but you kind of do very large blocks first of painting, and then of color or shape, of shapes of color, and then you let it dry, and then you go in and you start doing more of the blending, more of in the second or third layer, and then at the end you start adding in detail. So for areas, if for a focal point, you'd add more detail into that area, and you also the layers. The most important stage, I think, is the blocking in of those areas, because that determines what's going to be light, what's going to be dark, and that's critical in terms of making a half decent painting. Is the areas of value, light and dark. So
You're basically sort of building a painting. So like I've noticed a lot of times when artists are painting as an underpainting, they pick like a reddish color. Like why what's the purpose of that? Like
because, well, for landscape in particular, there's a lot of green, and red or orange is the complementary color to green, and so there's so much green in a lot of landscape work, and by having that red there, sometimes it shows through, and sometimes you keep it, sometimes you don't. But it actually acts as an accent color to kind of give a painting a vibrance that it would not normally have. And so that for me is really, really important, because I'm a total color nut, and everything I do about my work is either related to light and to color. And so uh, so by having that reddish orange, I actually picked that kind of technique up from a Hamilton painter called Julie Veenstra,
okay,
and she does all of her canvases in red background. But I don't do quite as red as she does. I'm more of a
rusty color.
sort of a brownie red, kind of almost a burgundy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, your colors, your paints are very very vibrant, and I guess that's I and you have an amazing sense of the play of light. So
Yeah.
a, how do you capture light and put that and make it look like light in a painting? That's a really
It's a tough one.
huge.
Um, a tough one. I Light has color, and light has color, and some of it's very cool, some of it's very warm. And I always, I never look at, in landscape, I never sort of think, oh, that light's yellow, or that light's necessarily. I really try hard to look at the light in terms of what's around it, and especially shadow, and how it's going to offset. Everything you have to paint has to go in comparison to others. So light and dark is always beside each other, and it has to kind of almost create a tension. So it has to create a tension in order for it to really play to the viewer. And so I'm always looking for the tension between the lights and the darks, and seeing how dark is this compared to this light. And so I'm always, that's what I tend to try to do, is really spend a lot of time staring and seeing, okay, how light is this going to be, and how dark is this really going to be? And then color itself also has levels of light. And so, of course, yellow and white are, up at the top range of the scale, but blue, very sort of ultramarine blues, and or Prussian blues, and uh, raw umbers and things like that are right down at the bottom of the spectrum. So I'm playing off those. I tend to like to play off purples and blues and yellows, I mean yellows and purples and blues and oranges, and if I can sort of do that, I'll have a more effective painting. I overuse white a little bit. I probably should use less than I do, but it is part of the work. So it's part of creating a lighter painting. So
Sounds very complicated. My brain's hurting thinking about trying to think about that. But I guess
you
that
always do the darks first. You always do the darks first.
becomes sort of intuitive somehow when you're painting, you're working in the moment, then you sort of start to get a more intuitive kind of a, or is it always a very thought, always very thought? Like, do you go through a thinking process every step of the way?
Do I go through a thinking process every step of the way? More and more than I used to, actually.
Okay.
It used to be way more intuitive, but as I've become better at this and as I've done a lot more work, I do have a definite step-by-step process. And because I'm a former teacher, and it doesn't look like I have a step-by-step process, but because I'm a former teacher, I had to learn how to think about how to approach a painting and how I approach the painting in order to teach those skills to my students. And so that took a long period of time. And the more and more I actually stick to the process, and I know this is going to sound counterintuitive to the way artists work sometimes, but the more and more I stick to the process, the better the work comes out. If I kind of lose my process or my shtick, I tend to do really stupid things to the paintings. So
You you were a teacher, so tell me a little bit about that. That was a previous career for you. So you,
that's right. I had 30 years as a visual art teacher in Peel, in Mississauga, and Brampton, and I now live in Hamilton. But I started out as a visual arts teacher. I actually started out with a degree in history, surprisingly, and that's where I learned to kind of think in a more systematic fashion. But and then I went to OCAD after that, and I picked up, and I started out in illustration and wound up going to painting and drawing because they said you're a painter. That's the way you think. So we're sending you to painting and drawing, and so I had to learn as a teacher how I was going to effectively teach students, because the one thing you want to do as a teacher is you want to make all students successful. And not everybody's equipped with an intuitive sense of how to see when they start out in art. But everybody can learn if you teach them a systematic sort of way of doing things, how to actually at least get to some level of proficiency, and so that's the way I approached it with my students, and it worked out pretty well, like for the most part, because they needed some structure. I think everybody needs a little bit of structure, and I'm sounding like I'm very like this. I'm not, but I'm sort of I'm rigid. I'm not at all, but because I creativity is sort of almost stepping out of the structure at times and trying and experimenting with new things. But I think it's a good idea to have the structure first and then be able to kind of almost step out of the box and make those creative decisions that are sometimes necessary. Yeah.
sometimes when you have things that are called, I guess, what you call mistakes, whatever, it can lead you on a whole other journey of
Yes.
exploration and creativity that you never knew even existed. I know as an artist, I've been in that place many times over the years, always involving my career as an artist.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's so wonderful. So where's your next trip then? Are you gonna have another?
Well, I'm going back to my favorite place in the end of July. We're waiting for, the campgrounds to open up. And my family, my husband and I are both former teachers. He is also a painter, and we're going up to Killbear Provincial Park at the end of July with my daughter and her boyfriend, and then we're going on up to Killarney after that, because the I know the campgrounds are slowly opening up again, and so and then I'm hoping, we were gonna make trips out west, all that kind of stuff. It's when we can move with the provinces, but right, Ontario is a wonderful canvas for me, so I don't mind hanging out in Ontario and going to as many different new provincial parks as I can. I want to go to Quetigo at some point, and the French River is a big area that I'd like to actually explore. But Killarney's probably my favorite place.
Beautiful. Well, that'll be a nice adventure. So thanks for coming on today and talking about your art and your painting and sharing
Thank you.
techniques.
Well,
And
I hope I made myself clear about it all and everything. So,
you did great. And I think, quite often we don't talk about the process of painting and and the structure of it, because a lot of people just think you just, whatever. But we want to give people ideas about how they might start taking up painting themselves, and also about showing off your work. So, and
Thank you.
very your wonderful skill that you've developed over the years, and it does take a long time to develop a skill at that level, and uh,
Yes,
it takes persistence, and it takes just doing it, right?
absolutely. That is one thing. Since I've retired, I probably uh, painted way more, like I almost 3 or 4 times the amount I would ever paint in a year when I was teaching. It's just it does take time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on today, and we will see you on the other side.
Okay, thanks. It's nice to talk.
You too.